Thank you. Nancy's going to read us a quote that it's a poem selected by our guest Edgar Porter, was written following the Russo-Japanese War, before the period of time that this talk is going to be about. And Mr. Porter told me that the poem was censored. It's an anti-war poem, and it was censored during World War II. And if I make any correction, Mr. Porter, Professor Porter, please add on to it later. Nancy, can you please read us the poem? You're muted.
Okay. Oh, wow. Wait a sec. That's a problem. Wait a sec, then. Oh, I'm not muted, it says.
Now you're not muted. Now
Okay.
You're fine, but we need to see the poem.
Yeah. Oh, my brother, you must not die, by Akiko Yosano. Oh, my young brother, I cry for you. Don't you understand? You must not die. You who were born the last of all command a special store of parents' love. Would parents place a blade in children's hands, teaching them to murder other men, teaching them to kill and then to die? Have you so learned and grown to 24? Oh, my brother, you must not die. Could it be the emperor, his grace, exposes not to jeopardy of war, but urges men to spilling human blood and dying in the way of wild beasts, calling such death the path to glory? If his grace possesses noble heart, what must be the thoughts that linger there? Okay. Oh, sorry. I have to.
Okay. Now you could mute. Thank you very much. It's very sad that we hear songs, anti-war songs. I'm not going to march anymore. And a poem anti-war, and yet wars go on and on and on, and they perhaps are even worse than they were before. And it's like we live in a humanity. So today we're going to get a chance to hear the way war was experienced by the other sides. We know that history is written by the victors, and we usually celebrate the victors' soldiers, but there are two sides to the conflict, sometimes more than two. Let me now introduce our speaker, who I met. He's a neighbor in Park Slope. I met him by chance outside our building, and when he was looking to see what's going on at Brooklyn Ethical, our lovely building, and I told him, and he told me a little bit about himself and about him having written this book that he'll tell us about. And I said, Edgar, please come and talk to us. This is a type of topic we are interested in. So Edgar Porter is a professor emeritus in the College of Asian Pacific Studies at Ritsumikian Asia Pacific University in Beipu, Japan. He has worked in higher education in 4 countries: Japan, United States, China, and Austria. He holds a doctorate in education from Vanderbilt University and an honorary doctorate from the Mongolian Academy of Governance. Most of his adult life has been spent in China, Hawaii, and Japan. His publications are in the area of biography and oral history. They include The People's Doctor, George Hatem and China's Revolution, Journalism from Tiananmen, Japanese Reflections on World War II and the American Occupation, China in Oceania, and Foreign Teachers in China, Old Problems for New Generation. He currently resides in Brooklyn and Park Slope, where he writes fiction and nonfiction. He is married to Ran Ying Porter, a co-author, novelist, researcher, and translator. Edgar Porter, please tell us your story. Show us your slides.
Thank you very much. I'll get the slides set up here. Just a second. want to make sure I can be heard.
You can be heard and seen. Thank you, Ed.
Okay. I want to thank Dror and Tati and Dupree, Nancy for welcoming me today and for joining me in this. I'm going to try to get through this as fast as possible, so maybe we can have some Q&A after. This presentation is based on the research in a book that my wife and I did when we lived in Japan for 10 years. This is the cover of the book, and it's a propaganda poster that we found, which was put out by the Japanese in the late 1930s to celebrate what was called the Anti-Comintern Pact, when Japan, Italy, and Nazi Germany came out to oppose international communism. And that's what this is from. So this predates Pearl Harbor, but it is a good sign of what was to come. This is the area that this presentation will deal with. Over here, you see the map of Japan. This is in red is Oita Prefecture. It's O-I-T-A, Oita. It's a small rural area of Japan. Up here is where you would find Tokyo. If you can follow my arrow, Tokyo would be here. Hiroshima is down around here. Nagasaki is down around here. And this is where I lived for 10 years in the prefecture of Oita. And over here are you don't have to get into the details of this, but the small villages and towns that we interviewed people to do this research. These are obviously clearly propaganda posters from the US to give you some idea about how the US was approaching the war against Japan right after Pearl Harbor. One of the reasons we wanted to do this book was because living in Japan, we started to meet lots of elderly people who had been children or young soldiers during the war. And they enjoyed, or they wanted to tell their stories. Again, this is a rural area. It's not Tokyo, it's not Osaka. So their stories were slightly different and very localized. So we wanted to overshadow this kind of propaganda poster that people had the idea of Japan during World War II and go and talk to them and get their stories. These are just two examples of over 40 people that we interviewed. On the left is former Prime Minister Murayama, who lives in Oita, in a very small nondescript house. And I'm there with our interpreter and our assistant who helped arrange a lot of our interviews. Kana was with me, and she was very, very pleased to meet the Prime Minister that we had arranged through a mutual friend. And this is him. And on the right was 99-year-old Miss Ono, who had 100 years basically of stories to tell us about her life in Japan up well before and into the war. We're going to talk about the children first. This is Mr. Kawamura. Mr. Kawamura we interviewed, and when he came in to the interview, he brought this book, which he was very, very proud of. And this book was made and distributed around China in 1933, to give you some perspective of the years. Now, we need to remember that a lot happened before Pearl Harbor in Japan. Japan invaded China. They had occupied Taiwan. They'd occupied Korea for quite some time. And so there was this imperialist movement on the part of Japan, which they felt was in some way their divine right, and in a way to take over parts of Asia. And this book was a pictorial book. And here we have one picture of the imperial family coming from heaven to save Japan. This was taught every day in the schools to the children in the 1930s. One other page is this. The title of this would be "To Protect the Emperor, Care for Each Other, and Die with Honor." So this is what the children were taught. during their moral education session. And the gentleman that you saw before had kept that book all those years. And one of the themes you'll see as we talk later are the things that people kept after the war. And he was really proud to show us this. It's an extraordinary book. There aren't many of them left, but he treasured it. Another interesting thing about him that we'll find out later is as a teacher, he taught all of this. And then when the war was over, he, like many others, became distraught that he had been teaching these things and now overnight they were told that was wrong. And this emotional and psychological trauma that many of them lived impacted a lot of people. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. He didn't go back to teaching for several years after because he just couldn't face the children again after this radical change in education. But anyway, this is what the children were taught. I went to interview this gentleman in his home and to talk about his experience during the war. And so what did he do? He went back and he brought out these paintings, drawings that he had done as a school child about supporting the Japanese in their military conquest. You'll see the planes are actually biplanes. So again, these would have been bombing in China, again, before Pearl Harbor. But he was very proud of these. He won awards for these from the school. And he kept these and showed them and makes quite a point. Again, this was what the children were taught in their school. So then we're going to move from pre-Pearl Harbor right up to Pearl Harbor. So what was the impact? What did people think about when Pearl Harbor came? So this is from former Prime Minister Moriyama, who I think I was checking the other day. He's still alive, I think. He's quite a gentleman. And here's what he said. I was just a kid. All I remember was that excited yay feeling when he heard about Pearl Harbor. This is Toyoki Goto, another one of our interviewers, said, I had no idea where Pearl Harbor was. All I knew was we were fighting a tough war, and even though I really didn't know what it was about. My teacher announced about the attack to us and urged us to be ready to die for Japan. Again, what the children were taught. And they learned. This is a photo from the small town where we lived. It's the town of Beppu, which is in Oita Prefecture, like the state of Oita. And it's down at what's the park today. And the children would go down to the park. You can see a soldier behind them. And they would be given these balls to throw at these images of Roosevelt and Churchill and Chiang Kai-shek. And it reads, death blow to America, Britain, and John. So this is what the children would do under the supervision of their teachers, but also the military, again, after Pearl Harbor. One of the kids, maybe not in this picture, but we found out about this through one of our people that we interviewed. He said he was one of those who would go down and do this. He sort of was a little embarrassed by it and a little bit shy about telling us, but at the same time, he wanted us to know what he and his classmates were doing right after Pearl Harbor. This is one of the more intriguing and at the same time sad aspects that we discovered. After the war, actually started before Pearl Harbor, but it really picked up, of course, with the war after Pearl Harbor. The girls who did not enter the military, so they had these auxiliary services in the villages, but also out on the streets. And the picture there is out on one of the streets where they would recruit all the women and girls on the street to do what they call these 1,000-stitch belts. On the right is an actual one that my wife and I came across in all things in an antique shop in Tennessee. We knew exactly what it was. We don't think anybody else in the shop knew what it was, but we knew what it was, and we took it because it shouldn't be there. It should be back in Japan, hopefully to find the family. Because what happened was these stitches, 1,000 stitches, you can see the individual ones. And then the soldiers were given them as a token of respect, and also to wrap around themselves when they went in battle to ward off bullets. It's called a spiritual belt in some ways. This became one of the more favorite souvenirs from the American soldiers during the war too, when the Japanese soldiers would be killed. So these 100 stitch belts were done all over the country, and the soldiers would take them, sometimes fold them and put them in their jackets or under their jackets, and sometimes wear them in the battle. So what was going on with the kids in school during the war? On the left, you can see elementary school, the military officer, and then on the right, a high school with the guns, wearing military uniforms. So here, I'll let you read this. I'll just summarize it. But Mr. Hashimoto talked about what it was like when they were in school and how they were trained, did military exercises. They wore military clothing to school, leggings and all. And then they would run their 10 kilometers and learn to fight with swords. That's his memory of when he was in school. This gentleman, by the way, was the Nissan dealer in Oita when I interviewed him. It's in his office where I interviewed him. This gentleman was actually born in Canada. His family had immigrated to Canada. The family had only so much land, and his older brothers had it. So he went to Canada, but then in the 1930s was his father and mother were told to come back with their family to the home farm where they were from, and he was to take his father was to take that over. So they came back to Japan, and we interviewed him, and he told us about his life, a little bit in Canada, but mostly we were there to talk about what happened during the war. And this is him on the right, in again the school uniform that the young people wore at that time. So I'll kind of let you read this, but I'll summarize it. So just after the Pearl Harbor attack, we experienced extreme militarism. I was 15 at the time. The military instructors were arrogant and mean, hitting and slapping us to instill military fighting spirit in all the students. I was physically rather weak, but I put up with it and didn't say anything to my parents. Although they must have known what was going on, they would never have told me to resist. Between the military instructors and the teachers, there was an unbridgeable gap. So when the military took their instructors into these middle schools and high schools, they pretty much took over the culture of the schools against the instructors. So this was his memory of what happened at that time. He was just scared. He was just scared. These photos I like very much. These actually are in Oita Prefecture. So there was a point where basically the kids just didn't go to school anymore. And the boys, a lot of them were taken to the areas where when the planes would come in after bombing the American ships mostly, they would come in for repair, and the boys were trained on repairing the airplanes. And I talked to some of them about what their life was like then. And they talked about, they just pieced them together with plywood or whatever they could find and then sent them back out. The girls on the right are preparing bombs to go into the planes. This was how the work was distributed to the kids who were brought from all over the prefecture basically to the major city, which is the city of Oita, and where they had the factories, the munition factories. Now, it's very important to understand that this small rural area was heavily militarized, even in the 30s. Naval bases, army bases. And so these factories were there to, the munitions factories and the repair factories were logically put in a place like this because it was already heavily militarized. And here's one more where students are working under the slogan, support our troops fighting in the Mariana Islands. Same location. This quote is from this officer who actually was over the soldiers from the area that we wrote about. A lot of the soldiers, they would come from, they were recruited geographically and would stay in their own geographic groups. And he was head of them. And this was his quote for his soldiers and for the citizens to know as they headed out to war. This is actually in this picture, this is Ran Ying, my wife on the right, the co-author of this book. And this is Mr. Kodama with his brother's battle flag. Earlier we looked at the belts, the spiritual belts that were given. They did these flags also where family members or friends would write, serve the emperor or fight hard or, come home to us, after you defeated the enemy. So this was his brother's flag, and we interviewed him, but he was also a soldier. And this is him on the left when he was just, becoming a soldier. And he wound up in Indonesia fighting when the war was over. When we went to, he survived, his brother died, but his brother's flag somehow made it back home. His flag was taken away at the surrender, so he didn't have one. So when we were meeting with him and we talked to him about his experiences, we asked, can we take a picture of you with your brother's battle flag? And he said, I cannot do that. He said, it's too shameful. We lost the war. I cannot have my picture made with such shame, with something so special as this flag. So we took a picture of the flag and have superimposed it here. But he would not allow that to take place. When he came back from Indonesia to Japan, he didn't leave his house for 2 years. It was a time of great, because of such shame of being a soldier and having been defeated. It was a time of hunger in this area. People were very hungry, starving, had tried to barter their kimonos for sweet potatoes out in the countryside. And even at that, he wouldn't go out to work. He wouldn't leave the house. So just to give you a sense of that defeat, the feeling of defeat that they were feeling after being told so much that they were winning. That was what was happening in the media. This is another young man, fascinating young man. He entered earlier than he should. Actually, the draft age in Japan was 20. Unlike the US, which is 18. It was 20, but he went in early toward the end of the war as a telegraph operator. And this is him and his wife on the right during the interview. Jiro, Nakano-san, was put on a ship to go, he also was going to Indonesia. That was a lot of the people from this area went to fight in Southeast Asia. His ship was bombed or torpedoed, and he wound up in a hospital in Saipan. It was on the way to Indonesia, and he was taken to a field hospital in Saipan, which was heavily populated by Japanese civilians because they had occupied that after World War I. So it was there that he was treated, but also he was visited by these young girls from schools who would come see the wounded soldiers, Japanese girls, because their families were farmers and businessmen on the island. And while he was there, they taught him how to do the origami paper cranes, piece kind of cranes. So the kids would teach these young soldiers that. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you now this video about what happened after he left, because it was still under Japanese occupation when he was evacuated and sent back to, or sent on his way to Indonesia.
After losing the capital city of Garapan, Japanese troops were pushed to the northern tip of Saipan, with only cliffs at their back. That night, Japanese soldiers, desperate and with few options, ran with knives, bayonets, grenades, and spears in a final all-out banzai charge to the death. Even the wounded charged into the Americans. Eventually, the artillerymen of the 10th Marines turned back the tide. The banzai charge had failed. After the banzai attack, the battle for Saipan ended. On July 9th, 1944, American commanders declared the island secure, then honored those Americans who died during the fighting. Marines were shocked by the tragedy that followed. Saipan was the first island captured with a large civilian population. Before the battle, Japanese authorities spread false propaganda about the Americans.
A Korean read a Japanese leaflet that said the Americans were going to kill all the men and take the women and children to the ships.
American interpreters and captured Japanese soldiers who became interpreters tried to intervene, but watched helplessly as men, women, and even children hurled themselves off Saipan's 800-foot cliffs. Hundreds perished.
So when he went to Indonesia, he was a telegraph operator, and he was the first one to get the word about what happened to the children that he had just been visited with, the children who had just made him these origami paper cranes. And he spread the word around. And when we interviewed him, this was his response. Children who taught me to make origami cranes killed themselves to protect the honor of their families, their emperor, and their country. They died heroes' deaths, honorable deaths, and were pure in spirit. I was deeply moved. This is all the years after the war. He still had this sense of these girls having upheld the honor for all of Japan who were jumping off those cliffs. This is a Japanese, I'm going to show another video here. As we saw, Nakano-san after wounded, was sent off still to go to the front. So this is a view of the Japanese going off to the front, sending their wounded off to the front.
また感じべきことは、こういうふうに優しき大和なでしくの手厚い看護を受けながらも、将兵諸君は例外なく一日も早く全開して現隊復帰、再び第一線に立つことを熱望しているのであります。さらば現隊復帰の命令下りや、当人は近畿弱薬、周囲はまたこれを羨望すること甚だしいのであります。諸君が数ある戦場者、あるいは内地お買いになった方が非常に多いにかかわらず、また元のような元気な戦後隊に通いまして、現代復帰されますことを心から国民のために、あるいは国家のためにお
Of course, this is what the people were seeing back in Japan. This would have been shown in the cinema back in Japan. Almost certainly, probably 90% of those soldiers that went off never came back home. This was a young kamikaze instructor, Mr. Yunakawa. The story is very interesting. I'll try to do it as summarize it here. I interviewed him. He actually was in Tokyo when I interviewed him, but he had been stationed down in Oita, where he was training young kamikaze pilots to go off to attack the ships off of Okinawa. This is a photo taken of him and his young pilots at a Shinto shrine in the prefecture, not far from their base. And they would go there before they would fly out. They would go there for spiritual reasons. And on the right is that exactly the same place today where they were sitting then. The thing that happened, the reason he didn't die, he actually was the instructor, but he was going to take them all up on a particular day in March 1945. And just as they were about to get into their planes, the first attack by American, I believe it was the Hellcats then, the Grumman planes, came in and strafed the airfield where they were getting ready to take off. And the planes were shot up, and they were literally just, within a half hour or less of taking off. So they lost most of their planes. They didn't get any of them off the ground. They tried to shoot down some of the American planes. But at that time, this was beginning to be the massive bombings of Japan. So he never went up. He was told that he had to go somewhere else and start training other kamikaze. And these young men were sent to other bases where they would eventually go up, never to return. So his story, he always regretted that. And we'll see at the end of this presentation how he ended it. And all of these guys going off, all the men going off to fight, what was happening back home? This is another Shinto shrine. It's a different one that holds the spiritual life of all the Japanese soldiers throughout history. And their statue in the middle is the mother with the two children looking, wondering if the husband or father will be coming home. So it's quite striking, I think, this sculpture. The face on the mother, you can see the kids watching too. I have one more video here because we're getting ready to move now to the area where, or to the section where Oita is bombed. It's bombed. There were over 85 attacks from the air on this small area of Oita Prefecture toward the end of the war. What I'm going to show here is related to the firebombing. This relates to Tokyo, but it is exactly what happened in the city where we were.
From bases on the newly captured islands, the Americans have begun a new offensive. The firebombing of Japan's cities. Sawaharu Hashimoto is an air raid warden in Tokyo.
The fires bursting out from the bombs spread like a magic carpet. In front of my eyes was a real scene of hell. On both sides of the road, there were people on fire. It wasn't possible to tell if they were men or women.
Masuko Saito.
We were surrounded by a sea of fire. I ran with my 3 children and jumped into the river. People were screaming and shouting. Dear God, please let my family be killed in one go.
In just one raid on Tokyo alone, more than 100,000 people are burnt to death.
So the bombing of Tokyo, if you heard the very ending, this was one bomb. I believe it was March the 9th, I believe. One bomb killed, well, not one bomb, I need to clarify. The bombing of Tokyo, the firebombing, which is basically early, it's napalm. The napalm we all heard about with Vietnam. It was burned to death, 100,000 people. Hiroshima bomb killed about 140,000. Nagasaki bomb killed about 70,000. So a lot of people in Japan have, their memories are vivid of the firebombing that took place, and they were more impacted in some ways by these firebombings. On the left here is a picture of Oita, the city, taken by US airmen. And if you look closely, you can see the explosions, you can see the fire bombs on the left at the river that are coming. And on the right, this is what was left after the bombing, the fire bombing. So again, it's basically napalm took place. I'll let you read this. I'll just summarize. This is our fellow I showed earlier, who's the Nissan dealer in Oita today. He talked about when the bombing came and they were working inside the factories repairing the airplanes. He said a total of 70 people died. I'd been in my workstation, but by a stroke of luck, I was away from my station at that time. But I remember clearly the screaming and the crying out of people. And again, these are teenagers, basically. They're 15 to 17, 18 years old. In the aftermath, we cleaned up the blood and the bodies, which were everywhere. Second floor had collapsed and crushed the skulls, brain matter spattered. I still remember every detail. This was the interview he gave to us. The students that died were all close friends. So many people died in the factory that we held a mass cremation by the river. There was no special ceremony for them, but after the war, the sister of one of the boys, one of my friends, had a statue put up at their school that they had come from to remember all those that had died during this bombing in April. He said, it's something that I can never forget. This is the statue that he talked about. It's still there. It's right outside the school. And you can see the uniform that the kids were wearing at that time looked like military uniforms. Every day, every year on April 21st, this gentleman and his friends and the families visit the statue to remember their friends who were killed on that day. We'll skip this one. This is a pretty graphic memory of something that happened to this family that was also bombed in another part of the prefecture. They were being bombed and they ran to a shelter when the bombing started falling. Got out of the shelter, and it was a surreal sight. Half of Nansho-san's house had disappeared. The roof was blown off, and the house the roof was blown off of her house, and it leaned to one side. So we soon found out what happened to Nansho-san. His wife had attempted to run to the shelter, but jumped in the river instead, which saved her. When we got to what remained of her, she was crying as she picked up body parts of her husband with chopsticks. If this wasn't hell, I don't know what was. She then goes on to talk about how some boys came up to her mother and some young boys, and said, "Is there anything we can get you in your house?" Because they were not allowed back in their house because it had been bombed. And the mother said, "No, it's too dangerous." But one of the boys said, no, it's okay. We've already been drafted and we're leaving for the front soon. It doesn't really make a difference where we die. So please just let us help you. So all this heavy bombing came. There was actually a book I used that said, no more targets. It was written by an American pilot who said, we used to, toward the end of the war, we were going into Japan to bomb, but there was nothing else to bomb. We bombed everything. Everything was flat. There were no airplanes left. They'd all been shot out of the sky or destroyed on land. And so they said, so the only thing that they were looking for was the invasion of the US into Japan, which was going to come up from the south, close to Oita. It would have been landing in this area. It was already planned. I've seen the military projections. The US military plans were to land in this area up and down the coast. And so preparing for this invasion, you can see how these are the women who were told if the Americans came, they were all going to be raped and murdered. And so they had to, this was how they were taught to protect themselves. There were no guns left. The women weren't shown to shoot. They just were going to have spears to fight off the Americans. And then this was a quote that was going around in Japan. The sooner the Americans come, the better. 100 million die proudly. So the bomb came to Hiroshima and then to Nagasaki. The Soviet Union started to invade from the north at the very same time. And finally, the emperor was persuaded to announce that Japan would stop fighting. And it's interesting to use the term stop fighting because in the emperor, here he's reading, and on the right, you can see the family listening on the radio. You can see that he did not use the word surrender. It was never used. He didn't say we are surrendering. As one person we interviewed said, no, we didn't surrender. We just stopped fighting. Couldn't bring it out to say to surrender. Go back to our kamikaze fellow. Yunakawa, when we were talking, he was telling me the story when the war was ended, and it came as a shock to him because they all still thought they had a chance to win, or at least to negotiate a peace. He just thought about all these young men he had trained as kamikaze who now died in vain. And so he went to his room and had a gun on his table. And he said, yeah, I was about to shoot myself because I couldn't go on after sending all of them and I had survived. when his commander came in and said, no, don't do that. We're going to send you to go underground, change your name, move to a small town, and be prepared to be called for duty again in case the Americans prosecute the emperor. If the emperor is under attack, you and others will be coming forward to help protect him. So he went underground, changed his name, married under a new name, and under an alias. And then eventually, when it looked like they weren't going to prosecute the emperor, he was given a message after some time, I think about a year and a half or so. It's okay, you can come out. They're not going to kill the emperor. So he came out, moved back, took back his family, his family name, and moved back to his hometown after that. And the same thing, this was a gentleman and his wife we interviewed, and he was Imperial Guard. He actually was sent from Oita, very high privilege, to guard the emperor in the palace in Tokyo. So he was there when it ended, when the war ended. And he was told basically the same thing, go home. He didn't have to change his name because he just went back to his farm back in Oita. Go back, work on your farm, but be ready for us to call you if we have to save the emperor. His wife was a nurse treating soldiers who were wounded in Okinawa and taken to the southern part of Japan. When the war was over, she was given, all the nurses were given syringes full of poison by their doctor who supervised them and said, if Americans come close, here's the poison to kill yourself. So she and her fellow nurses trekked back over days to the hometown back in Oita Prefecture from southern part of Japan, carrying these syringes. And she had quite a little, quite a personality. And so she came back, she said, you know, we were never had to deal with this because we were never attacked by the American soldiers. So I asked her, I said, so tell me, what did you do with the syringe? What did you do with the poison? And she just sort of looked around and kind of smiled. And she said, I don't know, it's around here somewhere, but you know, I don't think it would work anymore anyway. So these stories just kept coming and coming. Back to our Nissan dealer who worked on repairing damaged airplanes. This is his model of the Japanese Zero, because that's what he worked on. But look at the model. It doesn't have the covering. What he worked on was the infrastructure of the Zero, which he loved, which he could never, you know, stop having such affection for, and all these years of his life that he spent working on this. And so if this is in his office, behind his desk is this copy, this model of the Zero, which he very proudly brought out to show me at the end of our interview. And this is Mr. Yutani, who is actually our very first person to interview. If you look on the right, he is the one holding the Zero, this child who, with his mother, grandmother, and sister. His father was off in Thailand, working for the Japanese government. So they were sending him the Zero as a present, and it was bombed. The ship that carried this model was bombed. The father never got it. Strangely, it happened often, but some 2 years after the war ended, his father wound up knocking on the door back home. And he saw for the first time in his memory his father at that time. But this quote, I wanted to end pretty much with this. I only feel relieved that we lost the war. Otherwise, Japan would be just like North Korea today. These are just some pictures of today in Oita to show some of the nice, beautiful parts that are not war-torn anymore. These are some girls on coming of age day, which is 20. They come out all over the country on this particular day. And this is exactly in the center of where those bombs fell, which is now where the girls come out and people eat in their restaurants. Very nice. So thank you all very much for bearing with me during this time. This is my email, which is just my name, edgarporter@gmail.com. If anyone wanted to later email and ask any questions or wanted any clarification, or I'd be happy to do that. And then the book, I think, Tati, I don't know, Tati, are we going to show
I am
this?
sharing the link on the chat right now.
Okay. This is the copy of the book. Luckily, the publisher of the book, which was Amsterdam University Press, has put this up on what's called open access, which means the whole book, the cover, the pictures, everything is free online through open access. This is a very long address to find it, but I think Tati's going to put it up for people to get. So if anyone's interested in reading it, you don't have to pay for it. It's available right here. So thank you very much, and I'll stop with that. Should I stop the share now, Tati?
Please stop
Yes,
the share. Thank you very much, Professor. This leaves us all with a lot to reflect upon. How sad that this goes on, and I ain't gonna march anymore, and it's adults who send the children to fight, and who's brainwashed by who. It's just mind-boggling. It's a lot to reflect on. Tati, please play the next song as we think of your questions. We'll have a Q&A period after this. Thank you.
Please, everybody mute before we play the song so everybody can hear it. And feel free to start putting your questions on the chat for the Q&A while you think about it. Thank you.